Welcome to our week on comparative, international, and development education. This is a really important subfield for us at OISE. We have a collaborative specialization that students are able to join. It gives them a certain amount of courses that they need to take in the areas of comparative international development education, and it's connected with the CIDEC Center, CIDEC. And this is one of the biggest collaborative programs at the University of Toronto. And it's a really exciting place because we have students from all over the world. And many of these students have come to OISE to deeply understand through their research how they can improve their home country systems of education. And so when you go to the events that they have regularly, which are open to anyone, you're going to hear amazing initiatives from around the world trying to promote just equitable education in various countries. And so when I was a student, I was part of that program. And so at the core of my research, there has been a comparative element, beginning to understand how different countries do higher education, have their university sectors set up, and what that means when we begin to learn from different countries or assess how education crosses borders. And so when I came to OISE, I did a comparative study. And so for this lecture tonight, I'm deviating from my usual thing, and I'm actually going to share the personal story of my own dissertation. I think I hinted at it in the first class, but tonight I want to walk you through what really compelled me to look at two different countries and to begin to look at the cross-cultural experiences of students. So here is my first slide. Look at this photograph. I actually took this photograph from a real banner on a website of a branch campus in the UAE. And as soon as I saw it, I was struck by the image. What do you see in this? You're going to begin to observe when you look at this, that this is a very classic North American looking library. There are desks, there are shelves, there's possibly a fake or real plant. And when we look at the foreground at the two women here, we're going to notice that they've strategically identified the women with different ethnic affiliations or cultural affiliations. The woman on the left is wearing a hijab, which indicates in this picture that she may have Muslim connections. The woman on the right is wearing a cross. The woman on but both women are studying. And we might say that this image is supposed to say higher education and real focus on your studies will transcend these sorts of divides, these cultural, religious, ethnic divides. And I think going into my research, I wanted to know, do students develop new identities through study at a Western branch campus that may supersede or challenge past identities? So as I always tell you, for all of your papers, you have to have a strong research question. So here was the research question that guided my 4 years of study. And it really was about how students in Western branch campuses in diverse non-Western nations, how do they perceive the university as challenging or supporting their various identities? And of course, Malaysia and the United Arab Emirates are great countries in which to study this. What do they have in common? They both have really tall towers, trying to make themselves noticed in the economies of the world because they're both emerging economies. And of course, more important than this, they've both set up their education sector as a hub, bringing in both international providers of education as well as international students. So they want to be these hubs where education is a big industry that they're promoting. And the other really important piece is that these are countries where they have very divided ethnic populations within the country. So you have groups that may have a lot of political power, but not necessarily access to education in a strong way. You may have groups that have high economic power, they own the businesses, but they can't get into the public education system because it's reserved for somewhere else, or they can't hold citizenship. So in the UAE, perhaps the most dramatic example in the world of this, only about 11% of the population actually holds citizenship. The other groups are expatriate groups that hold citizenship elsewhere but live and work in the United Arab Emirates. And what's fascinating is that some of these groups from the Arab or South Asian countries have actually been there for generations. So these expats are not just transient populations of people who live there, have roots, and of course their children and their children's children want education, and it needs to be provided. In Malaysia, you have about 50% are ethnically Malay, who have actually a very strong narrative of being the first people in the area. The Chinese group were brought over as indentured servants by the British, and of course the Indian subpopulation as well. And so these three groups share this country in a really dynamic interplay of ethnicity. What's fascinating about this area is that, or Malaysia, is that there have been quotas on education in an attempt to make equity, but this actually had some interesting consequences for institutional reputation and prestige. So what does this mean for higher education? Well, this idea of reputation and prestige related to enrollment is really, really important. So if we take Malaysia first, they have 5 different types of institutions within the one university sector. So public universities, polytechnics, and community college, these attract low to middle income Chinese and Malaysian students, as well as Indian groups. We have private colleges, and then what is termed colleges in the sector, and these will take a range of middle income students. But then you have the Chinese subgroup, and the Chinese Malaysians have a lot of economic power. But because the public institutions have actually had quota for their Malay groups, many Chinese people don't perceive that as the best quality, and so they take themselves to other institutions. And the Chinese lobbies have set up these sort of educations, either with international affiliations to the West, bringing in sort of Western programs. Look up Help University; it's a fascinating business model. Sunway model as well, bringing in different institutions within one sort of branch campus area. And then, of course, there are ones that have an affiliation with China itself. And then you have international branch campuses that have come and set up shop entirely in the nation to attract these sort of higher income students from all groups. And you'll see that that's done for prestige is that you have your international branch campuses in Malaysia as your #1 top tier. You have your public universities as your sort of second top tier. And then you have these ethnic-based universities below that in terms of reputation and prestige. In the UAE, it's quite different. There's only an elite group of citizens and a few others that are allowed to go to these public universities, and they're very well funded with international partnerships. So they are seen as the most elite, prestigious, and unattainable for many. But then you have local private institutions like the American University of Sharjah or the American University of Dubai. These are often attended by wealthy students from the Arab expatriate group. And then you have international branch campuses from Western Anglophone nations and other sorts of international branch campuses or smaller institutions. And so you have a system where people have different views on reputation. And a lot of this data is from student interviews and as well as interviews with administrators. And here they are. So this was a qualitative study. This was based on observations and interviews over a 6-month period. I looked at 4 institutions, 2 in Malaysia and 2 in the UAE. And I interviewed a total of 49 students and 11 administrators. Now, what did I do when I actually sat down to talk to students? Well, I first asked the students to sort out what identities were important to them. And then we reflected on how these may have changed as a result of being at a branch campus. So they had this list from the literature, both the European literature on regional identities, so these larger collective political identities, and then the American literature on personal identity, which is a very interesting distinction in the literature. And then I invited students, you'll see there's some notes from a student's interview here, to sort them and tell me what was the most important. And this was a very typical finding here, that the #1 identities for students are things like family, as well as things like ethnicity or nationality. And this student said to me, there isn't one that's the most important. All 3 of these are the most important to me. And so I also asked students, of course, these are sub questions, by the way. You know, when I'm talking about your paper and I'm like, if you have a great research question, but it needs some sub questions to give you organization, it's a great way to structure your paper at the beginning. So I asked the students, did you feel supported or challenged in these identities at during your branch campus undergrad? And did the students find new identities popping up as they studied at a Western branch campus? All of my students were actually from business majors. It's the majority of programs offered by branch campuses around the world. So I went with sort of that majority. My students were business majors at Australian or British branch campuses in Malaysia and Dubai. And so this is just to show you the incredible range of different ethnic affiliations among my students. So this is an authentically diverse group, different worldviews, different places of birth affiliation, sort of language and religion. And it was so wonderful to talk to so many students and begin to see trends across the identity groups that they held close. And as I mentioned, this research really sits between the college development research that we see coming out of the US and the cross-border higher education that's linked to sort of the field of internationalization. And so I was looking both at how internationalization as a phenomenon, bringing students to different places, bringing branch campuses to different places, as well as how students actually change between 18 and 25. They come in as adolescents, they exit as adults, and what happens in that incubation time at a university. And so bringing together these 2 pieces, because we often have a lot of studies coming out of higher ed that are beautiful studies, looking at the experiences of a very small phenomenological group. And I was interested in my students, but I was interested in them as a global population that's being shaped in some way by higher ed. And of course, we know, since I've done this research, that we have major studies of demographics. How are we supporting populist leaders? How are we migrating for work? And what's happening sort of as a more sociological, macro-sociological view of different populations? And so I, of course, had to figure out what was I really looking at. And I always remember when I first, came to OISE, really excited about this, people would be like, identity, Grace, it's too vague. What are you talking about? And now I find myself saying the same thing to my students. Have you defined your terms? Have you sat with the concept, looked at it from all angles, and then clarified to say, this is what I'm looking at? Are we looking at student success, student engagement, student sense of belonging? What is the actual phenomena? Once we have defined it, once we've clarified it, then we can study it because we know what we're talking about. And everyone who reads our work will also hopefully know what we're talking about. So after reading a lot of work from the American and the European context, I came to this definition that identity is the fluctuating social categories. So where do I fit socially that are made tangible, so I begin to see them or realize them, through construction of formal and informal boundaries that distinguish groups or individuals from each other. And so those categories can separate me as the individual, say a mom or a cisgender woman in a heterosexual relationship. That separates me from a person who may hold all of those categories differently. But then socially as well, in the group categories, distinguishing groups, I also might be part of a language group or an ethnic group that separates me as well from someone who's next to me. And so the boundaries between these are sometimes formal, but sometimes they're informal. Sometimes they're things that are set up by institutions, and sometimes they're things that have evolved in communities and in different spaces. And so it's fascinating. And there's some beautiful, beautiful scholars, I think, in terms of these collective identities out of the European regionalization work that I think are really worth reading. So what did I find? Well, I began to find that we could sort out the identity literature into three big categories, looking at Bourdieu's sort of distinction between social and political or informal institutional, and then, of course, adding the American lens on individual personal. That university is a time to find yourself is a big sort of message in the American context, looking at some of those development theory experts. But then knowing that these students in these spaces were formed very, very significantly by things like whether they were a citizen or not, what language they spoke, what elementary and secondary school related to what home ethnicity that they went to. And so students began to say that citizenship, religion, their professional identity were these big identities for them at a political institution level. Class, ethnicity, language, and gender were sort of informal social identities that were important. And of course, some personal identities like appearance, family, ability, and spirituality. So this is interesting because these are sort of the if you look at the literature, these are the categories that sort of come together. However, when we begin to talk to students in other countries, we find that the students actually would put family as a formal institutional identity. And this is really important in the Middle East, where you're part of large family groups, some of which have political power and ruling power. And so in the context of the Middle East, that was an important identity. But of course, for the students, once they enter the space of the branch campus, the institutional space with formal rules and regulations, they were told, you're going to be a leader. In a business degree, we're going to have problem solving. We're going to make sure that we set you up to be this global business leader. For the women, gender had very significant, very formal social structural rules. They were going to get married after they did their degree. But then they entered the branch campus and it said, you can be a professional, you can be a career-oriented woman. And this is a new message. And for many of the women, they actually held these two identities together, as I'll share later. And so within the informal social categories, we find that ethnicity, ethnic affiliations, and gender were also part of sort of formal, social informal ones. And where we begin to make that distinction is that in some cultural groups, there are expectations on women, but these aren't written down anywhere. In other places, you actually have to be entering the country with a male supervising relative. So it's a very formal social identity that actually has documentation of your position. But of course, when you come into the IBCs, the divisions, social divisions came in terms of languages and regional affiliations. And of course, students didn't always identify in these individual terms when they were in their family units before they came to university, but because the Western values of individualism were there, they began to see family and gender as sort of these secondary, just personal things they were dealing with, which is fascinating. So what we begin to see, here's an example of a woman who was talking about how her identity as a woman really shifted in university. And she says, the woman thing kind of becomes an issue sometimes, mostly about the culture, like families and society. The society makes a plan for me. It decides I'm going to get educated, then I'm going to move on and get married and have kids, and that's how my life is going to go. But I'm more focused on, I want a career. I want to build a life for myself. So now that I'm set and taking it seriously, people are starting to seriously react to it. So you begin to see how her identity as a professional woman is supported at the I Branch campus, but her identity as someone within her family with a set future was really challenged. Here's an example from Malaysia. In the Malaysian context, many of the students would have had citizenship in Malaysia, but their ethnic affiliation determined whether they could go to a public institution, it determined what high school they went to. And when you think about the incredibly strong divides in these groups, every decision the students have made about education is deeply rooted in ethnic divides of the nation. But the students as well, when they got to branch campuses, being an English speaker was a big deal, having that identity as a professional and as a leader. And then, of course, individual academic ability was something that was a socially informal thing, was very important. And when you got to the IBC, it became, again, leadership and profession. And in the same way as in Dubai, family was relegated from an informal social identity, but one that held a lot of power, to something that was just a personal thing. Parents weren't necessarily invited into the branch campus space. And one of the things that came out really clearly in this is that the institution didn't talk about ethnicity, race, or language. It was an English-speaking institution focusing on business. But when the students did the group work, and there was a lot of group work because that was a huge priority for these business curriculums coming out of Australia, soft skills, problem-solving skills, pitching things for seed funding, the students would just divide into their ethnic, unless it was required to mix, they would just divide into their ethnic groups or their language variant. So here's a student, Jeline, who said, actually, right now I'm having a group and there's 5 of us, 3 guys and me and a girl. And yeah, I definitely agree that culture makes a difference, because these guys, I feel that Malays, they're more, I'm not being racist or whatever, but Malays are very relaxed people, I think. I guess, like, not saying I'm very good or what, but they're too relaxed. And so the ethnic stereotypes that people had when they were just put into groups without any coaching, without any cross-cultural supports in that, they began to get frustrated with the other ethnic groups because of the sort of stereotypical way that they were positioned. And so the group work didn't necessarily support group work because of these underlying divides. It actually enforced these things. The only place that we saw a difference, which was super exciting, was one of the curriculum requirements in one of the institutions in the UAE, where the students took a cross-cultural studies as their sort of bridging year. And then the student said to me, I learned so much. I learned that you're over here and I'm over here, but we can meet in the middle. And all these incredible cross-cultural skills that they had gained that actually made a really big difference. So what does all this mean for the university in the 21st century? Well, to summarize this, we have institutions in Canada, and students go in at 18 and they come out at 25. And the culture around them is similar to the culture within the university to a certain extent. So it may be very different from the home that they've grown up in, and there might be a lot of learning, but it's supported by sort of the cultural infrastructure around them. And that's just not the case with Western branch campuses. The students are in home and cultural communities. They come into the branch campus, and only in that branch campus is this different culture. And sometimes it perpetuates things like racial stereotypes. Sometimes it sets women up for a fight with their family. And we want women to have careers. We want them to be able to make their own choices. But we want to do that in a way that also allows them to make that change within a supportive family unit. And so we're seeing that the university is this institution that can shape identity for large groups and position them in different ways after their degree is done. And I really, really found that the theory, I'm always telling you guys, find a theory that helps to interpret or explain what you found. The theories coming out of the European context on individualization were really powerful to me. And this is identity work, trying to see like who we are and how that's established foundationally in our lives. One of the ideas within this is that if I back up 300 years, most of us were farmers and or working in some sort of growing industrialized city. And all the identities we're born into are given. I am the daughter of certain people. I have a certain religion I probably won't change unless I'm born into like the Reformation or something. I speak a certain language and I might just stay in this area. So those are very collective identities. But now we need to find our identities, to forge our identities, to develop our identities. And there's this wonderful quote by Bowman and Bowman that says, "No more was it seen No more could it be seen as given. So our identities are no longer just given to us at birth for our whole life. Instead, identity turned into a task, and a task which every man and woman had no choice but to face up to and perform to the best of their ability. Predestination was replaced with the life project. Fate with vocation. This term vocation, what's your calling in terms of your profession? There's a huge professionalization to this idea too, right? Like that we aren't people unless we have this sort of work ethic calling going on. Predestination was replaced by the life project, fate with vocation, and a human nature into which one was born was replaced with identity, which one needs to saw up and make fit. And so if we begin to think of what we're doing at universities and colleges as helping shape students' identities for the long term, we have to be considering how we're doing that. Are we doing it in a way that breaks all their ties with their cultural and ethnic groups that actually can create a very important foundation that they can learn so much from? Are we putting them in contexts that begin to perpetuate divides that already exist in society around us? Or are we helping them to forge these new identities with an appreciation of the history and value, both rooted in the past, but also identity and adding on identities for the future? Anyways, this is what I looked at, and I'd love to hear when we talk next week. I'd really love to hear your ideas. Where has the university challenged your identities, created new identities for you? Were you able to carry along the people you love, like your parents, in this journey, or were you pressured to sort of to choose either or? For many of you, you're international students in Canada. And so I'd love to hear how we can do a better job supporting you in classes, making sure that any stereotypes that you feel might be microaggressions against you aren't perpetuated in class. What skills do your colleagues need, do your professors need to be able to make a safe place for you to study? There's so much to talk about here. So I hope, ending this, that one, you now love comparative international development research. It's such an exciting way to look at the world, to begin to see what we can learn from different spaces. And I also hope that you'll bring your questions to class next week. Have a great week. And as always, stay in touch.